So this is Sunday, July 12th, St. Luke's Episcopal Church. We're talking about pilgrimages. This is our third week. And so far, the first 2 weeks, we've talked about Canterbury. I think the Canterbury section is going to be the longest part of this talk. I have several other pilgrimages that I've worked on, but being as that Canterbury is the only one I've actually been to, I have more to say about it. And of course, being Episcopalian, I have more to say about it. Canterbury is a really cool place. If you ever have a chance to go there, Peter, have you been there?
No, I haven't.
If you ever have a chance to go, it is a really cool little city. It's an old walled Roman city and very, medieval Europe kind of downtown, old city portion where there's just pedestrians and no cars. And the only drawback is the wall created some havoc with our cell signal. My wife couldn't, she's pulling her eyes at me right now. She couldn't get any cell signal inside the walls. But aside from that, it was a really cool city. And, I'd go back every year if I could afford it. It was a really cool city. And, but anyway, so we've talked about and we're going to finish up just a couple more things to say about the Canterbury pilgrimage, and then we'll move on. And we were looking at 3 different main paths that people take from Southwark or from Southampton or Winchester Cathedral. And I wanted to look at what do you see along the way, because pilgrimage primarily is a spiritual journey where you spend time thinking and contemplating about the place you're going to and about issues in your life and how they relate, and hopefully making connections with people on the journey. But it's also about what do you see along the way. And so I wanted to look at what do you see on these pathways. And if you take the Southwark Cathedral location, of course you see the Southwark Cathedral.
Southwark.
How, sorry? Southwark. Okay, sorry.
The W is silent. That's English.
Okay. Thank you for the correction. So the Cathedral of Collegiate Church and St. Saviour and St. Mary Overy, it stands on the oldest crossing point of the River Thames. Actually, this location for a couple centuries was the only crossing in that area. And my advance button's not working correctly. So you see the Southwark Cathedral, Southwark Cathedral.
What year was that built? What year was that built?
Well, who knows? In 1106, the church was refounded by 2 Norman knights as a priory. A priory is a convent or monastery, and they established the rule of a monastic rule according to St. Augustine of Hippo. So in 1106, it was refounded. So it was older than that.
Okay.
It's also a church that in the Augustinian canons created a hospital next to the church, which is the predecessor to today's existing St. Thomas Hospital, which is right next to the House of Parliament. So, certainly historically significant. And your question of when was it founded, I find that fascinating in history. Sometimes we don't know when castles or churches were first established. We have first references in modern writing to some things, but when was it started? Sometimes we just don't know. And so along the way to, hey Rob.
Hi Rob.
Morning.
Morning. Hi, Rob.
So some of the interesting things you'll see along the way to Canterbury, one is the Lesnes Abbey. Yeah, the Lesnes Abbey was founded in 1178 and was dedicated to St. Mary and St. Thomas the Martyr, which St. Thomas was martyred just 8 years prior. You know, he was killed in 1170, so 8 years later, he's already having abbeys named after him. And so one of the cool things about the abbey is what this is kind of a silly, amusing story. So the mulberry tree. What happened with the mulberry tree is King James I in the early 17th century. He thought, well, he wanted to establish a silk industry, and he planted 30,000 mulberry trees. But what happened later is he found out that silk moths only feed on the white mulberry trees, and he planted 30,000 black mulberry trees. So it was a spectacular failure.
Sounds like discrimination.
Well, you know, I think about at least once a month I buy the wrong thing on Amazon and have to return it. But, you know, that's not quite as bad as buying 30,000 mulberry trees.
And the Chinese probably knew, but they told them the black ones instead of white.
Right.
They wanted to unload those black trees.
But so if you decide to take the pilgrimage from London to Canterbury, you can stop by and see the mulberry trees from the 17th century. Another thing you see along the way is the Darent Valley Path, which is a 19-mile journey in this region between London and in the Seven Oaks region. And here's the let me turn my laser pointer on.
What, do you want to say hi?
It starts up here at the Seven Oaks Accident Repair Center and goes along this path here through some wildlife reserve. And so this is part of your journey. We're going to go ahead and take that footpath, and it's a really beautiful, beautiful scenery. I wouldn't mind doing it just to see the scenery.
Did you walk all 19 miles?
No, you know, we went to Canterbury. I didn't know about and we went to London too on our trip. We didn't walk from one to the other. I didn't know that was a thing to do. It would be really cool to do it. I wouldn't mind doing it at some point in my life. But we didn't take this walk. These are not pictures that I took. These are internet pictures.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And that's St. Martin's of Tours church built in the 12th century. You'll see that along the way. Anybody here ever been on a pilgrimage of any sort?
We've been to the Holy Land. That was a big pilgrimage.
Oh, that's cool. How much time did you spend there?
Oh gosh, probably a week, maybe 2 or 3 days in Jerusalem. But we saw, you know, went to Galilee and made it around the lake, and one of Judy Chard's educational opportunities, St. Luke's trip.
It was wonderful.
Oh,
I did a pilgrimage to Stonehenge, but I guess
that's cool. That's cool.
that was amazing.
Yeah, I've never seen it. That would be amazing. Well, y'all are welcome to share your stories. The Holy Land is the last one I'm going to talk about. So, Bud and Jen, you guys can take over on that when we get to that point.
We'll wait. Our stories are exciting.
You'll have more to say than I will, so that'll be great. Camino de Santiago. I'm sure everybody knows about Camino de Santiago. It's probably the most well-known Christian pilgrimage, also known as the Way of St. James. And I and I looked at this when I was finding information about it. I was like, okay, I know a little bit of Spanish, not very much. You know, Camino is the way or the road or the street, a path. And day, of course, is of. So the path of Santiago. And I kept thinking, why Santiago? How is that St. James? So I looked it up, and St. James, of course, you know, Sant Iago. So Sant is obviously Saint. Iago is from the Latin. It is the vulgar Latin for James was Iacobu, and it eventually degraded to Iago locally in this region of Spain. You know, as fun with linguistics. So the northwest portion of Spain was the Galicia region, which is also, by the way, a Celtic region. Even today, it self-identifies as Celtic. So, you know, we talked a lot about Celtic Christianity a few weeks ago. We were on that topic. So in that region of Spain, the northwest region is Galicia, which is a Celtic region, and their Spanish word for Iago, for James, Jacobo, eventually degraded to Iago. So the way of St. James, very long explanation of why this is called the Camino de Santiago, is the way of St. James. So why St. James? What is interesting about, what brings people to see his tomb and the cathedral that's there now? So what's the story behind St. James? Of course, St. James is you know, referred to in the New Testament. He was the son of Zebedee and Salome, and he was the brother of John the disciple. He preached in the Iberian Peninsula, you know, which is of course Spain and Portugal. You know, after the death and resurrection of Jesus, he went over to Spain. The disciples went all over the world, as we know, including England and all the way to India, all over Europe. And St. James, who is, you know, from the Bible and has the book attributed to him, he went to the Iberian Peninsula, and he converted a lot of people in Spain. You know, as we know, Spain has been Roman Catholic now for years, centuries, right from the beginning. And so what happened to James, he converted a lot of people in Spain. He spent decades over there. And eventually he took a couple of his disciples, his followers who converted to Christianity, and they went back to Jerusalem, he and three of his followers. And King Herod didn't like him preaching the gospel and had him beheaded in 44 AD. And King Herod also would not allow him or his followers to be buried in Jerusalem. And so some of his other followers, some other Christians in Jerusalem, took the body of St. James and his three followers, and in the middle of the night, snuck those bodies out onto a boat and hit the ocean to go back to Spain, to go back to the Galicia region, to bury him there, because that's where he spent decades of his life converting people to Christianity. Now, you know, Christianity in Spain can thank St. James for bringing Christianity to that region. And so here's a picture. Galicia, as you see, is that red outline, that northwest region of Spain, which looks like it should almost belong to Portugal. And that's where St. James spent decades of his life converting people to Christianity, and where his body was eventually brought. And there's a legend, you know, I don't know how true it is, but there's a legend that says the boat had no rudder, and it was at the mercy of the ocean and the tides, and somehow the boat made it back to Galicia. And they came ashore to a place called Pedron, which is a rock named after him. And there's a stone carving of the story. His followers carrying his body and the bodies of his three associates from Spain back to Spain to be buried. So what happens is So he's buried in this region. They named it Santiago de Compostela, which means Saint James of the Field of Stars. And so he was buried there, and through the centuries, eventually the exact location of the tomb was lost. We don't, for a couple of centuries, we don't know exactly where it was. We know it was somewhere in a general area, but they lost track of it. I don't know how you would lose track of such a thing, but it happened. And it was rediscovered in 813. And this is quite a story, really. So there's a hermit that was living out there, and this is the legend. And I believe it's true because the circumstantial evidence around it, and it sounds like one of those things you wonder, is this really real or not? You know, I mean, so he heard music in the forest, and he saw a light shining above this area, and somehow it came to his mind this was connected to St. James's tomb, and he went to explore it, and he wasn't sure of what he found, so he brought it to the bishop, Bishop Teodomiro, who was the bishop of that region at the time. And Bishop Teodomiro ordered an investigation, and they started exploring the area, and they found a tomb, and the tomb was very obviously of Roman origin, a Roman style tomb. So it was very old, and they found a body inside it, a body that was decapitated. You know, sure at this point it's just a skeleton, but there was no head, or the head was not attached. And thought from the style of the tomb and the beheaded body that this was St. James. So the King of Spain at that point declared St. James the patron saint of Spain, and he ordered a chapel to be built there. Well, as you know, as it goes throughout history, chapel eventually developed into a full-blown church, which eventually became a cathedral. And that was King Alfonso II, and he was the one who declared St. James this patron saint of Spain. And the place became known as Compostela, which means the field of stars. Compostela became, again, some fun with linguistics, evolved into Compostela. The other thing about this site is in 1879, there were more excavations. So this, you know, so the tomb was discovered in 813. The lost tomb was discovered in 813. 1,000 years later, there were some excavations at the site. And what they found in those excavations was another tomb attached to the original tomb. The tomb of St. James was attached to another one where there were 3 other bodies that were also decapitated. And if you remember from the story, earlier in the story, I mentioned that when St. James went back to Rome and was decapitated by King Herod, he brought 3 Spaniards with him, 3 people who were converts to Christianity from Spain. St. James and his 3 followers went to Rome, and all 4 of them were decapitated. Their body was brought by followers back to Spain and buried. The tomb was lost. And now in 1879, they discovered an attached tomb right next to St. James's tomb with 3 decapitated bodies. And this just fascinates me. So here they all are assuming this is St. James, this original tomb rediscovered in 813. And if you're like me, you're wondering, well, is it really? I mean, okay. I mean, we don't know for sure, right? I mean, there's nothing written on the tomb that says this is the tomb of St. James, but there's lots of evidence. It looks like a Roman tomb. Why else would there be a decapitated body buried with such ceremonial burial? And so it probably is St. James, but you still don't know, right? But then 1,000 years later, you find attached to that another tomb with 3 other bodies. I mean, how can it not be a St. James? So you go back to that story of that hermit seeing a light and hearing music and following it and finding this thing. It's like, how can that be any other explanation? I believe the story, you know, it as fantastical as it is. I still believe that I believe that story, and I believe that this really was God leading this hermit to rediscover the tomb of St. James. So this is why there was a chapel that developed into a church, developed into a cathedral there in this small little village. And really, there was not much of a village there. Now there's a big city, of course, but it's there because of St. James. It's there because of the Camino de Santiago, because of the pilgrimage, because like Canterbury, we talked about how Canterbury, as soon as Thomas Becket was killed, pilgrimages started right away. Same thing here with this rediscovery of St. James's tomb. Pilgrimages started immediately. People started flooding to see this location back in 813 from all over the place. And these are the major, we say the Camino de Santiago. The most popular one by far is the one that starts in France, over here in Saint Jean Pied de Port. But there are other ones. You can take this green path, which comes from Aviado, or start further up, or you can start from Lisbon in Portugal or Seville in southern Spain. These are all pilgrimages that have existed for centuries. But by far and large, the most popular one is the one that starts in France. It's the Camino Francés, and you'll pass through these major cities here: Pamplona, Logroño, Burgos, Leon, Santiago. And that one is 500 miles long, or 780 kilometers. And 60% of all pilgrimages to Santiago are the Camino Francés, so slightly more than half. And you'll go through the Pyrenees and through wine country. And it's a beautiful path to go through. And so some facts about the pilgrimage. As I said, it was 790 kilometers long, or 500 miles. Typical takes 30 to 35 days walking, walking 25 to 27 kilometers per day. So this is a retirement thing to do, or if you have vacation time built up. Typically costs between $30 to $60 per day. So total cost $900 to $1,800, not counting the gear you might need to purchase. And some terminology specific to this Camino, to this pilgrimage. Compostela, of course, the region is named Compostela de Santiago, but the Compostela was also the name of the pilgrim certificate that you get at the end of the walk if you complete at least 100 kilometers on foot. There are albergues and refugios that are accommodation stops, and these places are run by churches. They're run by town councils, nonprofit organizations. They provide cheap beds and dorm rooms and mattresses. They cost about €5 per night. They're not free, but they're extremely cheap. And you have to get if you do go on this walk, you get a credential, which is a passport. The various Camino-friendly organizations will give you. And you get this passport stamped at various locations, cathedrals along the way, or the refugios or albergues that you stop at. They'll put a stamp on it to verify that you were there. And you have to have one of these if you're going to stay at the accommodations, if you're not going to camp out in the woods or buy a hotel each night. And there's not a hotel, every stop you make along the way, you're not always at a city. Sometimes you're in the middle of nowhere. And so you need these churches to host you and place to sleep for the night.
Dave, it's Jennifer. I have just a statement.
Yes.
Okay, and this is sort of directed at Peter also, and I mentioned it before, but John Fritchner, an Episcopal priest who was an interim for us at one point, he did this, I believe, and Peter can say whether or not for sure that's right, but he had stories about it which were fascinating. He did the whole route, I believe.
He stayed with people. I guess people volunteer for you to, or ask if you want to stay with them. I don't know how it works.
He didn't do the whole thing. He did actually, he did 2 sessions with an older priest friend of his.
Okay.
They didn't do the whole thing, but he was there. I think he walked, I think he was there a week each time, if I remember rightly. And he said it's a hard slog, you know, you're doing that many miles a day repeatedly in the weather, which can be pretty foul in that area.
Oh yeah, yeah, and there are regions of it which are mountainous.
Yeah,
It's not an easy trek for sure.
they would stay at these refugios, and then every so often they would hop into a town and stay there for a night to get a decent bath and do some laundry.
Right. Yes. Yeah, you pass through several cities. That's always a possibility. Laundry in a hotel, and sightseeing and restaurants and all that. But you don't get that every night. Some nights you're able to do that. Yeah, it'd be fascinating. I can't imagine doing this. My so-called pilgrimage was an airplane ride to London, and a train ride to but I think in retirement I would love to do one of these things, either this one or maybe the St. David's in Wales. But boy, it's not an easy trek. Some serious exercise. You got to be in good shape to do this. That's for sure. And I imagine along the way you must encounter people and make new friends and just hear stories. I think this is much a part of the pilgrimage as the destination. I think it's about the walk and the journey, both spiritually and physically.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think I would recommend it before you're 60 years old, or even younger.
You may not have read in the paper that there was a lady who was 80 years old, Patsy Harkis, who used to be a member of the church. She was going to do this at the age of 80, but because of COVID-19, she couldn't. So she was sponsoring someone with ALS, a friend of hers, and she walked 500 miles in 35 days in and around Louisville, Kentucky.
I did hear about that. I think
we talked about that recently, either in Bible study class or
last week on this. And she did it, but she said sometimes it was tough. She'd do a morning of 9 and an afternoon of 8, or do 8:17 in a whole day. And it's so it's not something. And she was 80, or she is 80. I say was.
Wow.
So
incredible. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I this is hard for me to believe, but we've already been going for half an hour. It's already after 10. So I think we should close here and continue next week.
All right.
Anybody else have anything else to add?
Very good.
Thank you, David.
Good pilgrimage today.
What's that?
You're getting an expert at putting up the slides now, David.
Yeah, I know.
But don't get overconfident, because Zoom will
I believe me, I won't. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, nice to see you all, and
We'll see you next Sunday.
all right.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Appreciate it.
Goodbye.
Bye.